Good morning, and thank you for joining the second of a three-part webinar series hosted by the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact, focused on increasing the understanding of the Compact's third update to its regionally unified sea level rise projection for Southeast Florida. We hope you were able to tune in to the first webinar hosted last week, providing the technical foundations of the unified sea level rise projection. But in case you missed it, a recording of the session and all presentations are posted on the Compact's website by following the link in the chat window. My name is Lauren Ordway. I'm a senior program officer with the Institute for Sustainable Communities, an international nonprofit organization that works with communities in the US, China, India, and Bangladesh to unearth locally driven and equitable solutions to the biggest challenge we face: global climate change. For nearly a decade, ISC has partnered with the Climate Compact to provide implementation support for its work. Since the Compact's inception in 2009, it is focused on aligning local government action to build resilience to climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the four-county region of Broward, Miami-Dade, Monroe, and Palm Beach counties. In the Compact's early days, the partners recognized that the diversity of local sea level rise projections was a barrier to achieving regionally consistent adaptation strategies and policies and effectively influencing supportive policies at the state and federal level. And thus, they set out to develop a regionally consistent projection for the region. Since the projection was first developed in 2011, the Compact has released 2 updates to account for newly available climate science in 2015 and again in 2019 through the generous support of a technical advisory group consisting of scientific experts within the academic community as well as staff from local, regional, and federal government. The Compact also publishes an accompanying guidance document that contains specific guidance for application of the projection, as well as information on the technical methodology used to develop the projection. You can find this report on the Compact's website. Taken together, the projection and guidance report are intended to assist decision makers in Southeast Florida to plan for and make decisions about sea level rise and associated risks based on best available science to safeguard the people, communities, natural and cultural capital, infrastructure, and economic assets that underpin a prosperous and resilient region. Advance the slide, please. Mention us. Webinar use the projection curves in practice based on Am I back on?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes.
apologies for the technical difficulties on our end. As I was saying, today's webinar is going to outline at a high level 7 examples of how the sea level rise projection is currently being applied across local government and regional agencies in Southeast Florida, with the aim of showing the diversity of applications of this tool and the critical need to institutionalize the use of consistent science-based data-informed decision-making in the face of climate change risk. We hope you will take away concrete ideas regarding ways to integrate the sea level rise projection into your climate adaptation efforts. Please advance the slide. While the projection is indeed a technical tool frequently used to inform and design infrastructure, it is critical that we keep in mind why we develop and use the tool in the first place. The people of Southeast Florida are increasingly exposed to risks related to rising seas, and we know that these risks are borne disproportionately to frontline communities experiencing climate change first and worst due to existing inequities and socioeconomic disparities. People's lives, safety, daily movement, sense of community, and security are at risk and at the center of our efforts to plan for a more resilient future for all. Given this reality, while climate science is constantly improving, it's clear that waiting for scientific certainty is neither a safe nor prudent option. The policy decisions we make today are shaping the future of our collective coastal community and the lives of the people whom call this place home. Next week's third and final webinar on Wednesday, July 1st will take us beyond the technicalities of the tool and its application and focus on these broader issues in a discussion regarding the context into which this third regional projection is released. Next week's agenda will explore the projection within the context of Florida's emerging statewide resilience policy and legislation, communicating about risk and uncertainty with communities and the critical need for co-creating solutions with frontline communities, and making the case for continued equitable investments in adaptation. A few housekeeping items before I turn it over to our first speaker. This webinar will be recorded and posted on the Compact's website after this session. All attendees are muted. If you have technical difficulties, please use the Q&A box and someone will reach out to you to help you resolve the issue. Please use the Q&A function to ask a question at any point during the speaker's presentation. After each session, we will have time for questions. We will get to as many questions as possible, but given the number of attendees, unfortunately, we won't get to all of them. Finally, a link to the agenda and our speakers' full bios and emails are provided in the chat here for your reference. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Caitlin Cusinata. Caitlin is an analyst with Palm Beach County's Office of Resilience, where she focuses on coastal adaptation, developing a countywide resilience action plan, and geospatial studies. Caitlin has been integral to working with several other municipalities in Palm Beach County and developing a regionally collaborative vulnerability assessment. Caitlin, we're delighted to have you today. Thanks so much. Caitlin, you are muted.
Thanks, Lauren. The toolbar to unmute myself disappeared, and now it's back. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry about that. Thank you, Lauren. I was going to start with, I'm Caitlin Cucinata with Palm Beach County's Office of Resilience, as you mentioned, and I'll be talking today about a joint climate change vulnerability assessment we're working on with our municipal partners in Southeast Palm Beach County. I'll go into exactly how we're utilizing the Unified Sea Level Rise projections after I introduce the project. Can you advance the slide, please? So I'm not sure who all is in the audience today, so I wanted to give a fair introduction to Palm Beach County. So we are just north of Monroe, Miami-Dade, and Broward counties. Palm Beach County is roughly 2,000 square miles. We have 47 miles of coastline, 39 municipalities. And as you can see in the image in the bottom right, most of our development is in those coastal municipalities. So that is exactly how the Coastal Resilience Partnership plays in Palm Beach County and why it's so important to work on resilience along our coast. Advance the slide, please. So what is the Coastal Resilience Partnership? The CRP, or Coastal Resilience Partnership of Southeast Palm Beach County, is a joint effort between Boca Raton, Boynton Beach, Delray Beach, Highland Beach, Ocean Ridge, Lantana, Lake Worth Beach, and Palm Beach County to a small extent. We're working to complete a joint climate change vulnerability assessment, which is essentially a study of how current and future climate variations will impact local assets. As you can see in the figure to the right, these jurisdictions share several common features, including about a 20-mile stretch of intercoastal waterway, similar physical, geographic, and social characteristics. And we all experience similar climate change impacts, such as sunny day flooding, coastal erosion, changes in rainfall, and of course, extreme storms. We're also concerned about vulnerability to extreme temperatures, storm surge, and saltwater intrusion. And something we all found to have in common was a lack of a comprehensive vulnerability assessment on a local level. By working together to complete one collaborative assessment, we're hoping to reduce individual costs and avoid duplicative efforts. We're leveraging grant dollars. Thank you to the City of Boynton Beach for acting as our grant manager. And we're building synergy and consistency in our assessing vulnerability and developing adaptation strategies so that hopefully these will result in adaptation across boundaries. Next slide, please. So a quick timeline to lay the context of this project. The concept of the CRP was born in 2017 when folks from the micro region started discussions about resiliency and sustainability challenges. The group then discussed pursuing a climate change vulnerability assessment in 2018, and with support from a resilience planning grant from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection's Florida Resilient Coastlines Program, which is a mouthful, we were able to move forward on the project. Then with $72,000 in funding from DEP, we started to conduct outreach, inventory everyone's GIS or geographic mapping data, and develop methodology for a joint assessment. At the same time, we worked with local attorneys and students and staff from Harvard's Emmett Environmental Law and Policy Clinic, and we drafted a formal interlocal agreement and cost-sharing document. In late 2019, we officially embarked on this project, labeled the CRP of Southeast Palm Beach County, using DEP Resilient Programs grant, using the grant as a catalyst to help offset our costs and pool resources to conduct the study. This year, we're using a second DEP Resilience Planning grant to help offset the actual cost of the assessment and to support outreach efforts. We expect the study to be complete in 2021, as you can see in this graphic. And next slide, please. And the consultants we have on board are shown in this graphic. So our lead on the project is Liz Perez with Collective Water Resources, and it's also mainly led with Fernleaf Interactive and the team at Brazaga. Next slide. The scope of work our consultants are following is shown on this screen along with the projected timeline. So as you can see, we're working on tasks 1 and 2 now. We expect to be fully launched into the assessment just about next week. And we're hoping to have the report with an interactive mapping tool and a thorough report that each municipality can utilize overall as well as individually by March of 2021. Next, please. This is where sea level rise comes in. So you'll see on this slide the top 12 threats that we'll be looking at in the assessment. And you don't see sea level rise here because we're considering it more of a stressor, a primary stressor to multiple threats, rather than categorized as a threat itself. So you should be able to click now. Lauren, can you click the mouse? Should be highlighting, right, okay, so rainfall-induced flooding will be affected by sea level rise and compounding events in coastal areas. You can click, please. Shoreline recession, sea level rise may accelerate the movement of our shoreline. Click. Tidal flooding, sea level rise will increase frequency and severity until a threshold of persistent inundation may be reached. Storm surge, of course, sea level rise will increase risk, just higher storm surges. And then groundwater inundation and saltwater intrusion are obviously majorly impacted and affected by sea level rise, driven by sea level rise. Next slide. So we're hoping to look at natural resources, people, infrastructure, and land use in this assessment. And this is just a slide showing the assets we're looking into and what we've been gathering GIS data on, as well as narrative data for the report. If you go back to that slide, I just wanted to mention for people, we're looking at our census data and particularly interested in seeing how impacts of climate change may be disproportionately affecting communities in the region. So we're focusing with a heavy lens on the people portion of this project. Next, please. All right, so how are we using the unified sea level rise projection? This approach is not set in stone, but if you attended the workshop last week, you're fairly familiar with the graphic on this screen by now. So purple is the IPCC median projection on the graphic, and this will be used to look at assets with a shorter life cycle. For instance, a sidewalk or an isolated culvert. And then yellow, the curve above that, is the IPCC intermediate projection. And this will be used for assets that have somewhat of an adaptive capacity, so they can be adjusted over time. Examples of that would be communications infrastructure or facilities that would be used for longer than 50 years. The red curve, the higher curve, is the NOAA high. This is for critical and sensitive infrastructure that should be built with the highest sea level rise scenario in mind. So these are major critical and interdependent infrastructure, for example, nuclear power plants, major highways and bridges along evacuation routes, levees or airports, things that ultimately keep us safe and are not, do not have very much of an adaptive capacity. Next slide. So to apply these sea level rise scenarios, the consultant team will be looking at two planning horizons in 20 years at 2040 and 2070 and 50 years. So 2040 will be used to consider those assets mid-life cycle, things that can be adapted in 20 years, as we mentioned, like a sidewalk, for instance. And 2070 will be used to consider, sorry, I'll talk louder. 2070 will be used to consider all assets that do not feature an adaptive capacity or where incremental adaptation isn't possible. In the tables to the right, you can see that regardless of the planning horizon, assets most affected by lower levels of sea level rise will be considered higher risk, or in other words, assets with a higher sea level rise threshold will be considered less at risk. The overall approach will be centered around risk tolerance and adaptive capacity. But again, this is not the only stressor, threat or stressor we're looking at, and we're extremely happy to have the unified sea level rise projections to be using in our study. Next slide. So that's all I have. I'm very happy to go into more detail. If anyone wants to reach out to me, my phone number and email address are on this slide. And I think with that, we are opening up to questions. I apologize if I was quiet. I thought most of the time I'm too loud on this headset, but sorry about that.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. Great example of a collaborative effort. I'm curious if your group of partners have a sense of the type of cost savings you might be achieving by working on the vulnerability assessment collaboratively as a micro-region rather than each jurisdiction doing their own assessment.
Yeah, that's a great point. So first of all, I don't know if we would have received the DEP resilience planning grant if we weren't working collaboratively. They do prefer to work with regional partnerships and see folks come together to work to utilize their funds most efficiently. But I think the study, we've seen quotes for different vulnerability assessments from 300,000 to 500,000 and above, depending on the size of the community. And collectively, we're spending around 300 on this study with 7 municipalities, and as you saw in the map, portions of the county. So I think we're saving tons of money, and in the end, this will be sort of a pilot for the county to hopefully apply in other regions. So of course, Southeast Palm Beach County is not all that we're concerned with, and we work in unincorporated Palm Beach County, so we'd like to apply this elsewhere where we can see further cost savings.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in was, how far west does this particular assessment go?
I don't know if Lauren can pull up the slide number 2, but there was a map on there. Slide 3, sorry about that. Thank you, Lauren. So it doesn't go too far west. Originally, we were looking at the municipalities and then portions of the county just east of 95, just to fill in the gaps where, we're not covering municipalities that are not participating, but unincorporated areas of the county that we want to make sure are included in the communities. So the line that you see on this map in teal, the line butting up to the teal portion shows how far east the project study area goes. And that's mostly based on census data and the easiest and best way to aggregate our results without having to chop off census block groups or tracts and things like that.
Fantastic.
Hope that answers the question.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much, Caitlin, for this presentation. We are now going to move forward. And next, it is my pleasure to introduce Allison Higgins, Sustainability Coordinator with the City of Key West, a role that Allison has held for the last 8 years. Allison is a Jill of all trades, with her purview ranging from biodiesel to solar to gray water to floodproofing, all with the goal of helping Key West community adapt gracefully and in a dignified way to the impacts of a changing climate. Allison, thank you so much for your presentation today.
My pleasure. It's great to be here. I have the remote control. Yes. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm very excited that the Compact is doing this. I don't need to introduce myself now, but I do want to introduce our grantor on this great project, and that's the Sea Grant Gulf of Mexico Community of Practice, and our major partners firm, which is a great nonprofit that's been started working on our wind insurance and now is on our flood insurance for all of our residents, fair insurance rates in Monroe, and then Monroe County alongside the Monroe County Extension Service. So just like you guys, storm surge has played a major disruptive role in the Keys about once a decade. Georgia's in 98, Wilma in 05, Irma in 18 affected many homes at ground level. Their surges resulting in not only loss of personal items, but missed work days, homelessness, bad environmental conditions, great expense, and even greater stress and grief. Each major hurricane, about 3,000 to 5,000 residents throw up their hands and leave town permanently. And that's about 6% of our entire population in the Keys. But storm surge is also a large stressor during blue skies. Insurance fluctuations due to bigger waters, current FEMA remapping efforts have greatly affected the affordability of many of our homes, causing our low to medium income homeowners to either foreclose or, if lucky, sell low. So what are our problems in Paradise? Why? Because most of our lowest income homeowners live in our almost oldest homes. And I say that because the oldest homes in the Keys are in our historic district. These are stick built on the highest ground, easily moved or elevated, and incredibly sturdy. But our almost oldest homes were built in abundance just after World War II, when families were booming and storm surge wasn't considered. So while these can be stick-built with some crawl space, about 90% are concrete block, slab-on-grade construction. They're very sturdy, but they're incredibly expensive to elevate. These homes make up most of what we call our new town area, and tend to house our full-time workforce and our multi-generational families. So, these teachers, waitresses, policemen, house painters are disproportionately, that's a big word, disrupted by storm surge, as they are the least able to absorb these financial blows. Yeah, for some reason my slide is not. Next slide. There it goes. And FEMA's programs for this have failed us. The city of Key West has tried existing avenues to home elevation and mitigation to no avail. We went for a flood mitigation assistance program and drew hundreds of interested property owners from 3,000 qualifying repetitive loss properties. However, because of FEMA's stringent rules, only 14 of those homes made it to the final qualifying round, and only 2 were chosen for funding. These are dismal results to a community-wide problem. So most low-lying properties are very interested in getting out of the floodplain. They just don't know where to start. And not all are industrious and risk-averse to do it on their own, like this owner-contractor home in Newtown, which is why we are creating our own path. What does the average homeowner need to know to get them to elevate their home on their own? The Keys-wide Home Elevation Education and Organization Project, I really should have made that into an acronym, has been brewing for about a year now, 2 actually, and meets all of the goals of the city's adaptation coordination team. Next slide, please. So our very first step is to create summaries of recent home elevations, because we don't know a lot. There is a lot of misinformation out there swirling about price, eligible home types, insurance effects, permits needed. So collecting information from at least a dozen recent elevations in the Keys and turning them into front and back one-pagers will help. These summaries will help familiarize homeowners with the actualities of home elevation. And on the left, you'll see these are, the list of things that we're going to be covering, so that people can get their head around different types of things. And I wanted to, let's see if this works. We're going to click a couple times on this one. So here's the same house I showed you at the very beginning. The roof was damaged during Irma, so they didn't want to throw the entire thing away. So they removed the roof. Go ahead one more time. Gutted it, filled the inside with concrete to raise the new raise to the BFE, and then one more. Stretched all the windows and doors up in order to and put on the new roof. And this has happened to a couple of houses here in the Keys that we really want to capture and get the prices and get people's heads around. Next slide. So this is where our partners really help us on these Keys-wide workshops. We want to hold these near our 5 biggest population centers, and this allows us to share what we've learned as well as document questions coming from our communities. We want to get as many contacts from interested parties, not only for this project, but for other opportunities that arise down the pike. Because not everybody is going to be able to do this, even once we get them informed. So the intent is, so specific outreach to low and medium income is going to be used with our repetitive loss list, our county's weatherization program, because that is LMI based, and local Habitat for Humanity chapters that all really help have a specific program for homeowners that are low income. So they're on board to spread the word. But then for the grand community, which is also obviously included, we're going to record the webinars, newspaper stories, radar interviews will help broaden this information for all. These pictures here are from the first concrete block elevation in the Keys. This is the case study for what happens when you invest too much on renovations and trigger FEMA's 50% rule mandating an elevation. This will be one of the most expensive examples in our repertoire. Next slide. The next bit is the one-on-one. So, you know, we've gotten across this general idea of what these might cost, but we'll have two different advisors that we made available by appointment to help the homeowners work through their specific technical and financial issues in preparing to elevate. The intent is to give enough info to help the technical advisor, which is the elevation person, to provide an estimate within $5,000. That then will help the financial advisor help them figure out a way to pay for it. This is where the unified sea level rise projection comes in, because just because the minimum to get out of the floodplain might be 3 foot, it might be advantageous to raise 6 foot to maximize your insurance reductions, or 8 foot to keep that reduction in the coming decades. So these questions will be, all of these questions that bubble up from this will individually feed into a frequently asked questions guidance documents for future efforts. Next slide. And then step 4 is to organize cooperative bidding. This is the one cost that can, we hope, be minimized for the individual homeowner, because the mobilization to elevate a home is major. So using the Solar United Neighbors model, multiple homeowners will request a bid as a group for a shared construction timeline, and hopefully each homeowner saves money as an economy of scale. We hope to have enough interested parties in the 5 geographic districts to make cooperative bidding work for each of them. A key part of this is to vet those eligible contractors beforehand and have a very explicit scope of work to compare your apples to apples. Each homeowner will get an individual estimate and still have the chance to bow out. In the end, we'll get more data points and summaries for the project. One more slide. Our last step is to document and disseminate. Adding all these new projects to our elevation summaries will continue to broaden the understanding of our community on what to expect when you are elevating. We expect that lessons learned during the cooperative bidding process and the assistance program will be of great interest to many other low-lying communities. On a higher level, data gained through this project will also help inform current priorities of Key West for state legislature. Allowing PACE to include home elevation would be a boon for folks that may not have built up enough equity yet, like me. Or another issue for fixed income homeowners is the increase in total property worth that would happen when you raise your house, which increases property taxes. We hope to lobby for similar solar rules where property tax values are not taxed. Increases in property values are not taxed upon investment in solar. Last slide, and open for questions. Again, I want to thank our funder and our partners. I am open for questions, but also to advice, because this is the first time we're doing this, and I hope this has spurred an idea or two.
Great, Allison, thank you. Several questions came in while you were speaking. One is related to how, if any, the Village of Key West is updating zoning requirements to support adaptation to sea level rise.
We have, and we will. It's not specifically part of this project, but one of the things that we had to do, at least 5-6 years ago, was for our single family district, our height restriction is 25 foot. And so for an existing house to try to raise itself up, they might just pancake. And we cannot change our height restriction without going to referendum. So we actually had to craft a question for the ballot that won. It was like 87%, that for every foot you raise out of BFE up to 4 feet above will allow you to cross the threshold of the 25 foot to get yourself out of BFE.
Great. Another several questions came in related to sort of the observation that older Keys homes seem to fare well or resist the seas because water was able to flow under those homes. So the question is specifically about why would you fill a CBS, a concrete block home, with concrete instead of leaving it as crawl space? It seems like it would help to allow that crawl space with water storage during rains or flooding.
So in that particular example, in most of our CBS homes, there is no crawl space. you walked straight in and you were on the ground floor. So it didn't exist. You could put in some sort of layer to still allow that, but in this case, it didn't happen. I would say only about 10% of the homes in Newtown have some sort of crawl space already.
Okay. And I think we have time for one final question. Someone was curious about sort of the way in which, and I know we're going to be hearing from Rhonda as well. The question was actually specific to the county, but maybe you can speak to the city of Key West, but how you're thinking about planned retreat, which this person pointed out as being somewhat inevitable in the longer time frame.
So at this point in time, we are actually partnering with the county on the new upcoming CBGB MIT planning grant. So looking at a vulnerability assessment for the entire Key, so the county and our 5 small municipalities, but then going on to an actual adaptation planning. So we haven't gotten there yet because we feel we've got a good length of time until we have to worry about actual retreat.
Great, thank you, Allison. Really appreciate, this is a interesting partnership and really important to work in collaboration with homeowners in reducing their flood risk. So thank you so much for sharing this example. Next, I want to move on and introduce Rhonda Haig, who has been with Monroe County for the last 9 years, where she serves as a sustainability director and chief resilience officer and focuses on preparing the Keys community for the effects of sea level rise in what is one of the most vulnerable regions in the country. Rhonda serves as part of the Compact's leadership committee and has been a critical force for the last decade in regional collaboration between the 4 county governments. So Rhonda, thank you very much for your leadership and your presentation today.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Good. Yep. I just need the click so I can operate the screen. Am I getting a little, should I be getting a little message, Lauren?
You should be able to advance it, Rhonda.
Okay.
If not, we can have it, we can advance it for you.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay, let's just get going. Okay, so today we're going to look at, you heard Allison talk about, we have a countywide roads adaptation study underway. We're going to touch a little bit on that, talk about the climate sea level rise projections that you already saw in other presentations. Then we're going to look at a specific neighborhood in Key Largo, the Still Right Point neighborhood, where in previous years, especially last year, they had flooding on their road for 90 days straight in the fall king tide season. A little bit of touch on the policy discussion that roads elevation projects will bring about, and finally the next steps. Click. Of course, you see our beautiful county inspectors there assisting me in our inspections. So the purpose of the countywide road elevation vulnerability study is to develop a long-term roads adaptation plan to mitigate projected sea level rise conditions. Click. So the first task was the data collection, where a year ago we spent over $500,000 undertaking a mobile LiDAR elevation of all 300 miles of county maintained roads. And as a note, the mobile LiDAR is much more accurate than aerial flown. Aerial flown data can be off by up to 6 inches. So when you're looking at roads projects, you definitely need to use mobile LiDAR. Click. The task that we're underway now is the engineering analysis, where they're taking that mobile LiDAR elevation data, combining it with the Climate Compact's sea level rise projections, and doing the engineering analysis to figure out which roads need to be elevated, how high they need to be elevated to avoid impacts in the next 25 years, and when they need to be elevated. Click. And then when they get that task accomplished, so they're not, this particular study isn't going to adapt, prepare the engineering plans for all 300 miles or however many roads need to be elevated. They're going to do concept development. So they're going to develop several different concepts for different neighborhoods and different road opportunities to show what a typical road elevation might look like in different neighborhoods under differing conditions. Click. And then that, of course, might involve some policy review and regulations. Just because we can engineer our way out of a roads inundation issue doesn't mean we can't afford to pay for it. We're anticipating that this project might cost $1 billion or more to elevate the roads in the Keys. And so we might have to make some tough policy decisions about levels of service and can we afford to have no water on the road for the next 25 years? Or are we going to have, like our interim standard is right now, no more than 7 days on average per year? Next. Then finally, of course, not finally, but stakeholder and public outreach. It's very important to meet with the neighbors in each neighborhood to go over the various options. You're going to see how we did that for Still Right Point today because they have to have some input into the, because their lifestyle is going to change. Higher roads mean a lot of different ways to look at the road and your elevated mailboxes and your walkability and things like that. So you definitely want to have the stakeholder outreach. Next. And finally, that we come with the implementation plan. So you look at all the roads that need to be elevated, you see how you're going to afford to pay for them. If you can or cannot, or what your level of service is, then you develop a prioritized implementation plan. Next. So we're looking at 314 miles of county maintained roads in Monroe County. This does not include the municipalities. These are spread out over 21 different keys, so a very non-linear approach. A little bit more difficult because it's not, all compact in one city, and that's 1,202 different roadway segments. Very different communities, the Big Pine communities, very different from Key Largo, very different from Sugarloaf, so, a very complex, broad project. Next. You want information is available at that website. Next. So the engineering analysis currently underway. Next. You've seen this already. I'm not going to stick a lot of time on this. Next. So what we're using for the roads, because the roads have an average lifespan of about 25 years, we're using the NOAA Intermediate High. Now we did jump to the NOAA High and a NOAA Extreme for just looks at the next 60 to 100 years, but for this approach, we're going to the years 2045. And you're looking at 17 or more possible inches of sea level rise for you. Next. Next. So Still Right Point is a neighborhood in Key Largo, the northernmost area in the Keys. It's a very low level neighborhood. It's been around for about 45 years. It was built in a low area. They used fill from canals to build on, so it's very low. And what we're looking at here, last fall in the king tide season, again, as I said, this area had 90 days of water on its road straight for 90 days, varying levels of water. And this was all salt water. So residents had to drive through the saltwater conditions for 90 days straight. But they've had continuing problems with the king tide for the last at least dozen years to varying levels year after year. So this is 2035. This is what Center Lane is, one of the roads there. It's one of the lower roads. You can see what it's going to look like. This is sea level rise only. So if we do nothing, in 15 years, there's going to be 1.5 feet of water, up to 1.5 feet of water on the roads. Next. Next. Year 2045, we're looking at 2 feet. Next. Year 2060, we're looking at up to 3 feet. Of course, high impacts to the entire neighborhood. Next. This is a different road, South Blackwater Lane. South Blackwater Lane is a higher level road than the one you just saw, so you're looking at different impacts here. This is 2035, 2.2 feet of water on the road. Next. 2045, we're now looking at 0.7 of a foot. Next. 2060, 1.6 feet of depth. And you can see entire yards and properties will be have, it's not just roads that get water, it's the properties also. Next. So the existing conditions in Still Right Point. This is all waterfront properties. Some abut against natural ground areas. You can see the green there. And they're all very low roadway, and even the private properties are also very low. Even if they have elevated houses, that's not going to stop the water from coming in their yards and under their houses. Next. So we looked at the Blackwater Sound, that's up in Dade County, and that tidal buoy says that even with just rainfall, street flooding is going to occur. So anytime they get 4.4 of a foot of rainfall, they're going to see flooding on their roads, and that has proven very reliable. This neighborhood gets consistent flooding and heavy downpours in addition to the king tide fall tides. And this, of course, frequency is expected to increase with future sea level rise. Next. This is an area. It shows one of the neighborhoods, what it looked like in the king tide. Next. Another circle there, and that's this one coming up. Next. Just showing you examples of how it is. Next. And the next one is the deepest of all. That had almost 2 feet of water on that road when we were there that day, and that's all salt water as a reminder. So again, these residents, we probably saw it. It's been in the national news and international news, very poor conditions. And so the commissioners, while we were undergoing the countywide elevation study, the commissioners directed staff to go ahead and pull still right out and expedite the modeling and analysis to see what the anticipated adaptation options were. Next. So the engineering analysis currently underway. Click. We're looking at the years 2025, current years, going up to the years 2045. 2045 is basically a year, but then we also glanced at 2060 and 2100 just to have an idea of the future inundation. Next. We looked at, of course, the sea level rise and king tide predictions. We used the mobile LiDAR. Next. And then when you're building higher and wider roads, you have to now look at the anticipated storm surge in that higher road and wider road. So you're going to have to build it stronger. It's going to have to be able to withstand wind and waves and the extreme events, the hurricanes and other extreme events. Remember, when you have a higher road, it now has to be a stronger road. Next. And this data will now allow us to project what the inundation is going to be on the road surfaces, and then allow us to complete our vulnerability analysis and prioritization of which roadways get elevated and when. Next. So this is using the king tide flooding. We kind of wanted to show it's a little bit different from sea level rise. Sea level rise comes in from everywhere. The king tide flooding is consistent with impacts from a projected sea level rise, but basically in the fall right now, click, we are getting the impacts from, click, from the undeveloped properties. So that's why they're very low and the water is coming in because they haven't been built up at all. It's coming in from the vacant parcels. And in the next 5 years, if we do nothing, we're now looking at increased access through 20 locations by 5 years from now, click. And by 2035, we're looking at 66 locations where access will be come in for the king tides, one more click, and then 112. So you can see a pretty steep increase in king tide flooding if we do nothing. Next. So these are the we came up with several options. Actually, there were 6 options. This first option is installing a curb and gutter system. So we raise the road and then we install a curb and gutter system to gather the storm water from the road and to transport it away. So this is your typical roadway section. It's not as high and it's not as wide as some of the other options I'm going to show you. So there's less impact to the right of way. And again, as a reminder, this does not capture water from the surrounding properties, only from the road. And you can see in that house to the right, if you're in a ground floor elevation, you're now looking out your window, you're going to see a 2-foot high road in front of your window there. Click. And so there is front yard encroachment. All of these options have some level of encroachment. This one is a little bit less because we don't have the wider system that you're going to see in the next option, but we are going to, if we do elevate the roads, we are going to need to use a section of most residents' front yards to help build this higher and, remember, wider road. Next. And that's just a sample of where the curb and gutter system is. Next. Next. And this is what the road looks like today. So this is a corner where you have big house there on the left, it does have ground level living area. And on the right, note that white car there, click. And this is what the road would look like. So it looks pretty nice, right? But if you look closely, you're going to see water to the left and the right, and you're going to see how that car, if it doesn't do something with this driveway, it's basically going to have, 1.8 foot elevated road there. So they're going to need to, of course, address the driveways. They're going to need to, elevate the driveways. And we don't know what we're going to do about that house on the left. There's not much we can do, but as the seas continue to rise, it's going to rise on the private properties. As a reminder, this approach only gathers the stormwater from the roads. So that's alternative 1. Alternative 2, next. So this is where we're going to raise the road, but instead of using curb and gutter, we are now going to have a swale. It's a raised swale, and we're going to use inlet boxes to control the stormwater system. So this one has, because it's a wider road, you see that system, that swale, the raised swale and the inlet box there. This is the widest option. So this one has the most impacts to right-of-ways. And reason we looked at this because this option does perhaps allow some walkability. Well, like if we put a grate over that swale area or that inlet area, people will still have walkability throughout the neighborhood. And again, this option does not, you can see now front yard encroachment. So this has the most encroachment into the right-of-ways because it's a wider road. So might be some issues there with residents, whether they want to allow that. But again, this option only gathers and transports the stormwater falling on the road. Next. Next. Just an example of what this system would look like with the inlet box there, and we'd put a grate above that for walkability. So this is the current road again. Next. And you can see the green areas is where we need to reach out a little bit more. This is a wider system, so definitely more of an encroachment into the neighborhood. If you have neighborhoods with wider roads, it's not such a problem, but this area is very narrow. Okay, then we looked at the next option. This is alternative 3. This is where we raise the road, but we keep the swale at ground level. And what this allows us to do is capture the water that's coming into the private yards of the residents. We wanted to look at this because we thought, residents might want to see what this option looks like in terms of costs and how much the operations and maintenance costs. So now as the levels of sea continue to rise and come into the properties, it will flow over into that stormwater swale that's at grade, and then we will pump it out. So we're looking at more operations and costs in this area because we're going to have to be pumping almost continuously in the future. So this is a much more expensive operation in terms of operation and maintenance, but it does help control the water levels in the private yards. Next, to a degree. Next.
Rhonda, if you can move quite quickly through these last few.
Wrapping up. Next. Okay, so you can just see an example there. Go ahead. Next. And then the final one was where the neighbors, where we just said, what if we just throw some blacktop on the road? So we looked at that. So we're not elevating the road. We're only putting on about a few inches of blacktop. There's no stormwater system there. We would try some French drains, but with the elevated roads, we're not sure this is work. Next. Next, you can see what this would look like. Basically, the water is going to come in and inundate it. Next. Problem with this is when the water comes in, it's going to deteriorate the road conditions and it's not going to last very long. So this option is not really a viable option. It might last for 4, 5, 7 years, but then, the road would probably go away and the residents are going to have water on the roads. So very short-term solution. Next. So I don't need to go over this. Minimum short-term benefits, if only putting blacktop on and the road conditions will still be wet and will go away. Click. Next. 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 So this is just a joke. The solution to sea level rise. Are we going to have to pump the ocean? Well, we might have to pump some of it. Next. Okay, we also looked at driveway connections. When you have an elevated road, you have to elevate your driveway. Your pedestrian accessibility is going to be modified depending on the road adaptation option chosen. Next. Next. These just show some examples. Next. So walkability in the neighborhoods might be affected. If we're raising roads and they're only very skinny roads, you might not have a walkability option. So we looked at the different options. You can see options 1 and 2, 20 million. Option 3, the one where we're pumping the water also from neighborhoods. The cost is 21 million. The big difference between options 1 and 2 and 3 is number 3 is now a very high O&M cost because you're now pumping water probably full time. And then that only goes so long where you're basically just pumping the ocean, because this is one where we're taking private roads. And number 4 is where we're just throwing a few inches of blacktop. So options 1 and 2 appear to be the most, but options 1, 2, and 3 go to years 2045. We're not sure 3 is going to make it that far. So options 1 and 2 appear to be the ones that might be most applicable. Click. So the summary is low roadway, private property limitations. We're going to need to use right-of-ways. I already went over the evaluations, and I believe this completes my presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Rhonda. I think we have time for one quick question. You talked about difficult policy decisions and how expensive this work will be. There was a question about whether there's any thought given to abandoning right-of-ways or roadways, and whether the county is considering whether some of these things should be kept as assets. How is the county thinking or addressing these difficult questions?
So that's what the countywide roads adaptation study is all about. Not only is it going to look at, it's going to prepare an analysis of what needs to be done in terms of road elevation. It's also going to look at cost. And for instance, if this comes in at several $1 billion, we don't know yet because that's why we're doing the study. But if it's, $4 or $5 billion, that might not be something the county can afford. That's when we're going to need to look at, okay, if we can't afford to do this, what are we going to need to cut? Are we going to need to lower the level of service countywide? Or are we going to need to look at individual roads? Perhaps, as you saw in my presentation at the summit in December, if there's a neighborhood road that's going to require $20, $30, $40 million worth of adaptation, and there's only a few residents that live on that road, we may need to do a different level of service for that road, perhaps letting it get wet during the king tide season, or we may need to look at other options like abandoning that road altogether. So that's part of the countywide roads adaptation study. We'll be looking at those type of levels of service and policy decisions.
Thank you, Rhonda. You are certainly on the tip of the spear and navigating some really challenging issues and doing so with great analysis. So thanks for that presentation. I'm going to move forward now, and we are running a little bit behind, so I apologize for not being able to take more of your questions. I'd now like to introduce Elizabeth Wheaton, Director of Environment and Sustainability at the City of Miami Beach, and Amy Knowles, the Chief Resilience Officer of the City of Miami Beach, who are going to co-present the next session. Under Amy and Elizabeth's leadership, Miami Beach has rapidly advanced adaptation planning and projects in response to sea level rise and flood risks. The department focuses on climate change mitigation and adaptation through the lens of sustainability, environmental resource management, and urban forestry. Recent innovative projects include the Urban Land Institute's panel on stormwater management and climate adaptation, a business case analysis of their stormwater program, and working with the city's floodplain manager on the National Flood Insurance Program's community rating system. So welcome, Elizabeth and Amy. Thank you very much for your time today.
Okay, great. Well, good morning. As Betsy's loading up the presentation, we're gonna tag team this today, and I think we can go ahead and get started. So I'm really happy to present with Betsy. I know she's been participating in the compact for many, many years, and we're going to talk today about how we've been using the sea level rise projections over the past 8 years or so, and also how we've been evolving in our use. So we're going to share a little bit about, next slide, Betsy, the recent business case analysis to help illustrate the impact and value of our programs. We're going to talk about some new historic property guidelines that we've developed, and then also something that we don't talk about a lot, which is how to maintain our tree canopy through sea level rise, and how important that will be, and how we can change our species to adjust. Next slide. So a little bit about Miami Beach. I mean, we are a low-lying coastal barrier island. Like many cities, our infrastructure is old, about 100 years old. And so we not only have stormwater and flooding concerns, but we also have concerns with our water and sewer system as well. We have a very, very low elevation. We're about 2 feet on the western side, on the bay side, and we go up to a balmy, I would say, 11 feet on the Atlantic side. So about 93% of our properties are actually a part of the FEMA special flood hazard area, and we do have good flood insurance coverage. But you know, we're very vulnerable, and about 30% of the city is actually within a historic district, very important to us. So when we talk about land use, because we're only 7 square miles, and we talk about sea level rise, we really have nowhere to go but up. Next slide. Great. So the picture in front of you is actually the former sea level rise projections. We're in the process of updating the slide. But it was really important for us to be able to communicate to our residents and elected officials that the decisions that we're making in new land use regulations and our decisions about infrastructure is directly tied to the vulnerabilities that we face with sea level rise. So that our participation in the compact has been very important and been informing this work. We're so close to sea level that now any increases can be reflected in our groundwater. So we see water coming up through our storm drains. We see very low seawalls being overtopped. And, you know, like I said, we will be updating this, but we also are adding on to this the extreme tidal events, which we are seeing more and more of, and which we saw quite a few last year. So that's really important to us, and we monitor all that through a Power BI dashboard as well, so we can really understand the number of higher tides that we're seeing. Next slide. So I think like many of you probably on the line, there's just such a need to illustrate the value of this investment. Construction, one thing that we've seen, is very disruptive, and it is very difficult to move these programs forward. And sometimes it's not about how much you study or the type of pictures you have. People just are very concerned about the disruption, and the harmonization for private properties is very difficult, especially if the properties are low-lying. So one of the things we did is pull together a team, which was led by ICF, to create a first-of-a-kind study to help us understand and communicate the value of these investments, both from a public infrastructure perspective as well as for the private property owner. Next slide. Some of the assumptions that we used for this, we had to choose our assumptions, and at the time what we had was the city's 2013 stormwater improvement program. And so we were looking at about 1 foot of sea level rise. At the time, we felt that was about a 30-year planning horizon. And we know now it's more aggressive. So we looked at our investments, and we looked at a few different things, with and without sea level rise. King tides, a 5-year storm event, a 10-year storm event, and a moderate hurricane, which is about a Category 2 storm. So we looked at the type of damage that it would cause and how adapting can help reduce that damage. Next slide. So this slide really puts together all the different pieces of this. One of the things we did was catastrophe modeling to look at what type of impact we would see and what type of damage we would see. So we worked with AIR to create a special model just for Miami Beach. We also created a new drainage model using an advanced ICPR4 modeling in one neighborhood to really be able to take the different types of water that we're looking at, from groundwater to tidal to rainfall. And we modeled out the system that we're planning for that area and looked at how effective it was in draining water with sea level rise as well. We also looked at an advanced economic model. So we created one for Miami Beach. This was done by ICF, and essentially we did a hedonic model that isolated flood risk and elevation and examined people's purchasing decisions based on that. So this was really interesting because normally when you see how other people, other cities examine property value reductions from flooding, it's generally comparing an area that's inside the floodplain with an area that's outside the floodplain. And since we are entirely within the floodplain and entirely at risk, we wanted to see within Miami Beach, what is that impact? And then Betsy, you can click through the bottom. And what we found, not a big surprise here, but storm surge losses increased significantly with sea level rise. We also found that the public infrastructure, we were able to highlight exactly how that reduces our flood levels, but it's also really important for individual property owners to adapt as well. Next. We did find that over the last 15 years, analyzing that data, that home prices are higher for parcels with higher elevations, so increasing by about 8 to 11.5%. For average parcel elevation, and then even being closer to elevated surrounding roadways, there's an increase of about 4 to 14.1% per property values. So again, that was looking at about 15 years of data, and it demonstrates that people are making purchasing decisions based on elevation. Now, to test this, next slide, we actually applied it to one of the neighborhoods that we have elevated the roads at already, and that's Sunset Harbor. So when we applied that model, we were able to see that the increase is about $41 million pre-project versus post-project, holding all other variables constant. So we now have this model and we can apply it to future neighborhoods as well. And it's really useful to do our own analysis, which is important to counter some of the narrative out there about property loss value due to sea level rise. Next slide. So in the end, and we have, of course, a lot of other details, but we estimate that about $2 billion in road elevation and storm protection is cost beneficial. And that's looking at the avoidance of property damages as well as the increase in values from road elevation. And so I'm going to go ahead, and I'm sure that I could go in much more detail, but we're trying to keep on time, and I will turn it over to Betsy now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. All right, so we've heard a lot so far about stormwater and how cities can plan for sea level rise as it relates to stormwater, but that's only one piece of the puzzle. As Miami Beach is incrementally adapting to sea level rises and the challenge of climate change, we're also looking at the built environment. As recently as March of this year, the city retained Schulman & Associates to complete a study of the historic districts and develop adaptation guidelines for the city. Miami Beach's historic districts and structures are a vital component to the city's cultural identity and architectural heritage. So as we're thinking about the future, preserving these assets is a must. This study specifically looked at the Flamingo Park and Collins waterfront neighborhoods. On average, these neighborhoods are about 3 feet above sea level rise. So this study looked at sea level rise predictions and storm surge for the year 2080. And it found that in 2080, the water levels were going to exceed the current base flood elevation. So this plan, oh, please, next slide. Oh. Okay, there we go. So the elements of this plan include one, quantifying water. So understanding how groundwater influences our built environment was step one, looking at the sea level rise projections in relationship to storm surge. Two, the plan defines the current conditions. So it established building typologies in these historic neighborhoods. So everything from your cottages and single family homes to the catwalk style apartment and low rise hotels. Next, the plan looked at best management practices. So for example, we looked at Venice as it relates to adaptation and how we're adapting those structures. We looked at Amsterdam for the living with water approach. We looked at Chicago and Galveston as we think about raising and how do we raise potentially these historic assets. And then we also looked at landscaping. So for example, Oregon has a very robust program. And then of course, stormwater management is a component that we have to think about. And we did some case studies for New York to understand what the best management practices are and how that can be applied to Miami Beach. Utilizing this information, Schulman was able to put together resiliency guidelines, and it was separated into 3 distinct categories. How do we take action now? How do we adapt in place? And how do we raise and become resilient into the future? All right, next slide. So that's one piece is, our built environment, our historic assets. We also have to think about our green infrastructure. Another element that makes Miami Beach unique is that we are a tropical paradise. So how do we protect our urban forests with a strategic approach, understanding that we have challenges that any urban city has, which include narrow right-of-ways, underground utilities that are, spaghetti underneath the streets and sidewalks, high groundwater, and in our case, how the city as a whole is adapting to sea level rise and how that urban canopy is going to need to adapt accordingly. Next slide, please. So the Urban Forestry Master Plan, I think of the most exciting piece of the plan is this toolkit. Calvin Giordano under Davie Resources Group developed this toolkit to help us target specific design and implementation. So looking at how we plan, plant, and maintain our trees. Selecting a right tree, we established an adaptability and resiliency index. There's 10 factors that different neighborhoods and types of trees were scored based on factors such as salt tolerance, resilience to relocation, which is going to have to be an option as we raise streets, as well as thinking about wind and other climatic conditions. We also looked at how we plant trees. And so I'm going to go through a case study of Meridian Avenue that goes right through the heart of our Flamingo Park Historic District. Next slide. So this slide, you can see how, and it says mahogany, but it's actually calophyllum. I apologize for that. How these calophyllum trees create this beautiful canopy and arc over Meridian Avenue. This is a road that anyone who lives on Miami Beach loves to bike ride and walk down as you're heading through South Beach. So as we're thinking about this low-lying neighborhood and the fact that we're going to be raising trees, how do we preserve these trees for as long as we can? Next slide. As you can see, this is a potential option that the city can explore as we move forward with our neighborhood improvement programs. It would be establishing a gravity well in conjunction with pervious concrete and pavement to allow water to percolate down and get to the tree roots while still creating that sidewalk space because of the narrow right-of-way. This is just one example in the plan, but the plan can has many more, including soil volumes and different strategies depending on the types of trees to think about sea level rise. Next slide. So I just want to conclude that, the reason that we're doing all of this is to maintain our viability as a city. An important piece of that is maintaining our bond rating. So it's everything from adapting our stormwater system to looking at our neighborhoods and built infrastructure that's allowing us to reduce our risk and keep our bond rating. Final slide, and then we're done. So we're ready for questions and happy to dive into more info.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Amy. There was an interesting question that came in the ICF modeling and cost benefit analysis. Are you able to comment on the equity and distributional considerations that were included in the analysis? How may they have been, how might they have influenced the results? And somebody also, a similar question, you don't have to maybe take both of them, but how, if at all, you're thinking about the COVID pandemic and how that might impact your economic model?
Sure. Well, the economic model that was used is called the hedonic model, and it looked at about 15 years of purchasing decisions in the city, and it also looked at elevation. So that's really how that model was created. But I can say going forward, we have a study with Jacobs Engineering, and they have about 4 different options for the order of the neighborhoods that we would select to go forward with our adaptation programs. And they're taking into account a few different things. One being the current infrastructure that is below the streets and in terms of how quickly they need to be replaced. And then also the extent of benefit, which is really looking at the population that's in a certain area. And the idea is that we would prioritize projects that, yes, have low elevation, but also have more people that they're going to impact, so that our multi-residential areas, which some of them are much more lower income areas, we have about 16% below poverty rate on Miami Beach, would receive, they would go a little bit higher up the list, based on that extent of benefit. So it is something that we've thought about. With respect to COVID, right now our projects are funded by bonds, and we have a couple projects that are funded, but as we move forward, I think that will be a concern. It is a concern, and we're going to have to cross that bridge when we get to it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, ladies, both. I'm sorry we don't have time for more questions. I'm going to move forward to introduce Dr. Jennifer Gerardo, Broward County's Chief Resilience Officer and Director of the Environmental Planning and Community Resilience Division. Jennifer oversees countywide climate resilience initiatives, water resource policy and planning, environmental monitoring, shoreline protection, and marine resource programs. Dr. Gerardo is a member of the Climate Compact's Leadership Committee and has been integral to the Compact's inception and is central to its ongoing multi-jurisdictional efforts and successful collaboration. Thank you so much for your presentation today, Jennifer, and your leadership.
Thank you very much for the invitation to participate. Let's see, I'm going to see if I potentially gaining control over the screen today. I think that there were, really great presentations leading up to mine, and I don't have quite the same level of neighborhood detail that's been highlighted in these others previously. So, that's something that many of the cities are able to work at a scale that perhaps we're not in Broward. Clearly Monroe has done some really great neighborhood scale analyses. What I'll be talking about a little bit more is some of the community-wide analyses that we've undertaken to inform what I'll call our future condition standards and some of the efforts of utilizing, of course, the sea level rise projection to inform the hydrologic modeling that's been a foundation for our advancement of resilience standards focused on trying to keep sea level water, rising seas at bay, addressing infrastructure within the urban landscape, and managing better the water that we will need to deal with as a combination of both rising seas and increased rainfall. Next, let me see if I can address these slides. I think I did. So just in terms of highlighting some of the varied considerations, and these include representations of projects from across the compact planning area. Clearly we've heard examples of needing to reevaluate land use, potentially short and certainly long term regarding rising seas. There's dramatic impacts on the performance of our drainage systems, and so looking to account for that in terms of eroded capacity that we've already realized and anticipated change over the next several decades, and incorporating that into systems today. More diverse resilience standards, for example, I'll touch on our tidal barriers standard, challenges with regards to anticipating evolution of FEMA flood maps. Not only is there a desire to ensure that our properties are designed to mitigate and minimize future flood risk, but also the insulation that can be derived by planning for higher standards as it relates to flood insurance rates in our communities, and trying to help ensure that mortgages and flood insurance continue to be affordable, and then considerations for just where we choose to put infrastructure relative to this combination of challenges before us. So this slide shows what has been the historic sea level rise projection for the region. It's important to recognize that while we just adopted all of our counties at the updated sea level rise projection that was released in 2019, we still have this whole body of work that's been informed and requires multi-year investments that's been based upon the previous projection. And so now we'll be quickly moving to try and incorporate this update in forthcoming work. But we do have a lot of investment that's advancing and informing standards that we're going to be adopting just this year that doesn't yet incorporate those changes, and that's realized because we just have so much process. So I just want to acknowledge that our early planning tools in our county have been focused on, first, the establishment of a priority planning area map. This delineated the areas at increased risk of flooding with the 2-foot sea level rise projection. Most of our planning was based upon a 50-year planning horizon, and as I said, that anticipated increase of 2 feet. That required that when applicants, municipalities, and private developers would be looking at changes in land use within these areas, they'd be bumped to to a higher level of review, and we'd ask very specific questions about resilience planning and investments, not just for the site, but in the coordinated surrounding area and associated infrastructure. So that's been part of our process since 2012. The next step, though, this was just kind of bathtub analysis. We then looked at the countywide implications of the change in groundwater table on the of sea level rise on the change in groundwater table. This occurred concurrent with our board's adoption of a future conditions map series, and this was the first map that got brought into the series. And so what we found is there's more of a dramatic reduction in soil drainage capacity in the eastern portions of the county, but we also saw a change in signal that occurred as far as 6 miles inland. So we were already seeing a decline in the function of many of the drainage system components, such as surface water retention, wet retention, or I should say dry retention and wet retention, French drains, the performance of drainage wells. And so this information ended up being really important to address what we already knew to be an erosion in system function, but also accounting for this change moving forward. The next application of our work then, I'm trying to get to the next slide, please. The next application in our work was to, and this was a study that was undertaken in collaboration with the Army Corps of Engineers over a period of several years, but was to apply that sea level rise projection in a hydrodynamic modeling to evaluate how best to keep the rising seas at bay, recognizing that we were in many instances just seeing free flood of water from these lowest entry points, similar to what's been highlighted in other images. And so we took an analysis of combined sea level rise of 2 feet, high tides, and high frequency storm surge. And the results, long and short of that analysis, is that we arrived at a recommendation of establishing a 5-foot NAVD standard by 2050. Allowing up to 4 feet or allowing 4 feet up to 2035. Just this spring, our county commission adopted the change in land use and to county ordinance that now requires consistency in this, what we call the tidal barriers to flooding. Requires municipal adoption within the next 2 years, and that is relevant because we are able to use compliance with this ordinance as a basis for some of the determinations that we might make on land use. We found in this process collective support for the standard. It was clear that we needed consistency as we could see improvements being made and not yielding the benefits because it wasn't met by similar standards by adjacent properties. And I would just like to point out that we're not mandating that seawalls are the solution at all. We clearly emphasize and support and hope to see more in the way of resilient and natural shoreline improvements that don't rely on just a mere hardened seawall. And I want to point to the city of Hollywood, who undertook a tremendous improvement at a marina, brought that up to the new standard. This was actually built to 4.5 feet NAVD, and it's a real premier project where previously this marina almost served like a shoehorn, funneling water into the adjacent neighborhood. I'd encourage folks to take a look at that. Next slide, please. Currently, we're working with Geosyntech, and one of the subs on the project is Taylor Engineers, and now we're addressing the issue of flood elevations and finished floor. In our county, we utilize a number of tools to establish the finished floor elevation. One is a community-wide flood map. This has been a forward-looking map that's anticipated changes in land use and tried to evaluate the maximum flood elevations or the 100-year flood elevations under this condition of build-out, which we've now realized, and what we've found is that this map that used to be predictive in flood elevations and more forward looking now seems to be on par with FEMA. And in fact, we're in some cases might even see the FEMA flood maps surpassing our own. So we've been now working to update this community flood map in order to incorporate the combination of our modeled increase in groundwater elevation, the impacts of a 2-foot rise in sea level on the discharge capacity at coast, the combination with extreme high tide, as well as a combination with increased rainfall. Now, you can see how some of these maps combine. We anticipate the community flood map continuing to be evaluated alongside the other tools, and the requirement being for the highest of the modeled elevations to be utilized as the minimum finished floor for the projects. We are not done. We're still evaluating scenarios in this evaluation, but we do anticipate having modified flood maps shared with our stakeholders and part of our community process this fall, and looking towards adoption by the County Commission towards the end of the year. We expect this will go a long ways, again, to mitigating for flood risk, as well as fluctuations in insurance rates as the FEMA flood maps continue to be updated over the ensuing years. We are working to ensure that our requirements stay ahead of those maps. However, I'll note that with the FEMA's undertaking of the coastal A zone modeling, our work did not yet incorporate that coastal A zone work, and eventually we anticipate seeing both of these maps merge. But because of that run-up of storm surge captured in the current FEMA flood map update in establishing the coastal A zone, that is likely to establish a higher standard in many parts of the county until we're able to merge those two efforts. Next slide, please. So that takes us to today, where here we are wrapping up this work, all based upon the 2-foot sea level rise scenario, just as we've updated our projection. So the next steps for us to go back to that early work and start to amend now some of those early work products, while we also incorporate these changes in these existing projects. So we are in the process of updating that priority planning area flood map that I shared with you. Is initially adopted in 2012. We had an amendment in 2015. We're in the process of public workshops now, bringing forward the 40-inch increase in sea level relative to 2000, or 3.3 feet. That's what's shown in the graphic on the right. We had our first workshop just yesterday, I believe, or the day before. We have another workshop on July 7th, as you can see here. And here's the go-to link should anyone want to participate in that exercise. I'll note that that's not only relevant to land use planning, but it's also a map we use in all of our own county capital budget processes. It's something that's also to be incorporated as we look at surtax funded projects, which are funding transit improvements in our community over the next 3 decades. So many applications as a kind of a first flush of vulnerability and resilience requirements and needs. Next slide, please. We're also working with the USGS to update our groundwater table map. As I indicated as an antecedent condition in our flood modeling, we expect to have the updated groundwater table map available to us by the end of the calendar year. We'd then expect to take that through our regulatory process, knowing all of these tools and planning efforts are iterative. And then this final application is to take this modeled work that we have of our updated flood map for the 2-foot sea level rise scenario. I anticipate incorporating a 3-foot analysis, and then running, utilizing this model result to establish and inform a community-wide risk assessment and resilient infrastructure improvement plan. You can see what the components are, but ultimately we intend to undertake a sub-basin analysis countywide of the total, basically the amount of water that we need to be able to more efficiently manage. We've talked about the design standards for new infrastructure. We've talked about the design standards for keeping water at bay, but we have a whole lot of existing infrastructure in the landscape, and we will require modified water management strategies, modified distribution of water management, incorporation of water management features within the landscape not present today, anticipated redesign of redevelopment opportunities, coordinated and interconnected storage in order to better mitigate for these water elevations. We know what we anticipate. Now, now the question will be, how far can we go with our water management improvements and redevelopment strategies to mitigate and reduce those levels to the maximum affordable benefit for our community. So we're going through that process. Look forward to advancing really tangible and implementable strategies as part of a countywide effort, and we will be working to quantify the collective benefits of those improvements as benefits to evaluating risk and helping to ensure maximum credit as we look at risk rating, insurance, interest, bond rating, investment, benefits, etc., and having that coordinated value as opposed to kind of the one-off that comes with individual projects. We expect many synergies will be derived by taking this approach and having a common platform that can be used by all of our cities, planners, and agencies in our collective investment projects and strategies. So with that, I'll go ahead and conclude, and hopefully we have a time for a question or two. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Certainly a very comprehensive look of future planning. I think that you covered this in part, but just there was a clarifying question. Has Broward or any municipalities actually amended the future land use map broadly, or has it so far been limited to site plan review and individual land use map amendments?
So I'm not sure that I actually understand the question well. So the priority planning area map itself is applied countywide and wouldn't require municipal amendment. Whether the cities are formally amending, there is not a requirement that they formally adopt the map, but the acknowledgement is that our land use authority is countywide, and so to the extent that we've adopted that map, I've expressed how that has relevance and application to some of the cities' investments and initiatives. There are opportunities for them to utilize that map more proactively, such as potentially adopting adaptation action areas, as had the city of Fort Lauderdale in emphasizing capital improvements and recognized vulnerable communities. And we would hope that the map be utilized in that manner and mechanism. So it doesn't have the same mandate for formal adoption, but it does have countywide reach by virtue of our countywide authority. As it relates to the future conditions map series as part of county ordinance, that's not formally part of the land use plan, but it's recognized a kind of a set of tools that's part of our regulatory process. And in that regard, most of that authority is countywide also, as we have countywide authority as it relates to water quality and flood elevation, and water management very much ties into that. Drainage districts do have separate standards, but most do defer to county standards on matters such as this. So again, it doesn't require city adoption because of our countywide authority.
Fantastic, that's clarifying. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Really appreciate the very comprehensive presentation. I'm going to move forward to our next speaker, Akin Awasana, Chief Hydrology and Hydraulics Bureau at the South Florida Water Management District. Throughout Akin's 30-year career, he has guided technical teams responsible for evaluating several key initiatives ranging from Everglades restoration, regional water supply planning, development of operating plans and strategies for flood control and infrastructure, and assessing the effects of sea level rise on the district's assets. Akin, we so appreciate your engagement and expertise today. Akin doesn't have a webcam, so we're just going to be hearing him. Thank you, Akin.
Thank you very much. I thought I would spare all of you my COVID beard. But anyway, good morning. My name is Akin Awasana. I'm chief at the South Florida Water Management District, and I thought today I would spend some time sharing with you how we've used sea level rise in one of our key initiatives or projects. Advanced slide, please. Okay. Excellent. So just in case some of you are not familiar with the Water Management District, I thought I'd plug the district in the first few slides. We're one of 5 water management districts in Florida. We're the largest of the 5. We cover a 16-county area. from Orlando to the north, extending all the way down to the Keys, and we serve a population of about 8.7 million residents. And in that space, we're responsible for managing the primary flood control system, restoring the Everglades, and meeting the areas, the region's water needs. As I mentioned, our district's the oldest of the 5. We've been in existence since 1949. And one of the key things I want you to take away from this particular slide you're looking at is the word flooding, which is bolded. Advanced slide, please. Okay. To do the work we do, we operate what's known as the CNSF, Central South Florida Flood Control System. It's a system that was built by the Corps, operated by the state, that's made up of multiple miles of canals and levees, more than 1,000 control structures, and note the word structures here. We have more than 70 pump stations, and it's a large and complex system that's operated to balance the multiple needs of the region. And some of these needs that include flood control, water supply, restoration, water quality, competing needs, and sometimes will push you in opposing directions. But we run that system, and for today's presentation, the key on this slide is the word structures. Advanced slide, please. So the reason I wanted you to think about structures is because we have several of them that run along our coastline, the coastal structures. They serve a dual purpose. They are the structures we use to provide flood control. We open them to discharge stormwater, and that's how we keep most of the inland portions of the district from flooding. But we also use those structures as what's known as salinity barriers. We close them to make sure that saltwater doesn't go in and contaminate or seep into the aquifers that we use for drinking water. Also, we use them to kind of hold the water level on the inland part high enough so that the water table is high enough to keep the gradient towards saltwater, also supporting our water supply mission. But for today's conversation, I'm going to focus on those coastal structures, and you have several of them shown in the of the 4 figures you're looking at. The one that's to the bottom right shows the location of our coastal structures. The thing I want you to note about this is that they are gravity structures, almost all of them, which means they work when the water level on the inland side is higher than the water level on the ocean side. And therefore, water flows downhill from the high side to the low side, and we're able to discharge water under those conditions. The challenge is as you have rising sea level, the tailwater condition of the ocean side starts to get higher. And at some point, it will be high enough to reduce what you can discharge from the inland side, or maybe even high enough that it's higher than the inland side, and you have to close the structures so that you are no longer able to provide the flood relief you are able to when it rains. And that is the challenge that the district has to be able to deal with as part of the primary system. Next. So realizing this, and more than a decade ago, we went through and did an assessment, a vulnerability assessment at all of the coastal structures, and tried to see how at risk the structures were to rising sea level. And the color coding on this essentially shows the areas that the dots in red represents the most vulnerable structures, and the ones in green are the ones where we have a little bit more leeway or some more time. For those structures in red, most of which are in Miami-Dade and Broward County, and some also on the West Coast in Collier County, we have a condition where as the tailwater or the ocean side rises, those structures are being closed for longer and longer periods, and they're becoming less efficient at providing flood relief. And the quick question for us then would be, what would we do as time goes on and we have to keep operating the structures? Do we need to plan for some type of adaptation? Advanced slide, please. And to answer that question, for the entire region, the district put in what's known as a flood protection level of service program. What this program allows us to do is to use a formal and systematic approach to identifying and prioritizing the agency's infrastructure needs, flood control assets especially. As I mentioned earlier, the CNSF system was built many, many years ago. Some of these structures were built in the 40s and 50s, and they are approaching end of life. And as they're coming due for refurbishment or possibly replacement, one of the type of questions we're asking, or that we'll have to answer, is can we replace them in kind? And if we replace them in kind, will they continue to provide the level of service that they were designed to provide? or would we have to adapt or modify these structures so that they can continue to serve the region for the next 50 to 100 years? And to be able to do that, there's some type of analysis needed. And that analysis relies on looking at projected changes, including changes in sea level rise or the tailwater for these gravity structures. I'm going to add one thing here before I leave this slide, and that is for the program itself, the level of service program, we kind of broke it into 3 distinct phases. They interlock and they work well together, but the initial phase is what we call the assessment phase. It's a problem finding phase. It's not looking to fix anything. It's just identifying if flood control assets are doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that's going to be what I'm going to be spending some time talking about with you today. Advanced slide, please. So how do we use the sea level rise projections? Well, this is the summary slide so that you know exactly what it is I'm going to say, and then I'll get into the pet topic I want to talk about. But we use it in each of the 3 roles in a little bit of a different way. For the assessment, we use it in a somewhat non-traditional approach, which is what I'm going to share with you today. And we use it in all phases of the work. We use it in framing the problem, defining boundary conditions, identifying what the issues are, and determining what the time frame for action is. And so, advanced slide. Okay, so you've seen this curve, and I could spend some time talking about it, but in the for the sake of time, I'll completely avoid it. But essentially, what we're looking at is for all of our coastal structures, and as you've heard from many of the speakers today, there's a traditional approach where you pick a planning horizon, either based on the type of asset that you are looking to study. And based on that timing horizon, you select sea level rise condition, and then you do your analysis. One of the things we ran into with that program very, very early was we had a program that was going to run for multiple years. The assessment piece cycles through the district every 8 to 10 years and continues in perpetuity. And so we had to find a way where the analysis would stand the test of time and would be able to accommodate the changing projections on sea level rise, because you have to keep updating based on new information. And so one of the approaches we looked at was an approach that actually stepped away from looking at the projection first and following the traditional approach, but took an approach that said, let's look for the thresholds for our assets, the important thresholds that if you reach, the assets become less efficient or eventually ultimately fail. And if you can find what those thresholds are, then you can back your way into seeing what kind of sea level rise conditions will trigger those thresholds. And this approach, advanced slide please, and this approach, which has been coined, has been called the conceptual adaptive resilience model, is what we opted to use with the assessment portion of our level of service program. Essentially, and I'll spend a little bit more time on this slide, essentially what it involves is you take a look at your assets, in this case, the gravity coastal structures, and they lend themselves very well to this type of approach because they rely on physics. There is a combination of headwater and tailwater that will discharge a known volume. At some point when your tailwater rises enough, you cannot discharge that volume. Doesn't matter what made it rise. But when you hit that point, then you know you are losing efficiency, and at some other level, your structure actually fails. It doesn't do the job it was meant to do. So we, instead of starting with what the level of rise was, we started by doing the analysis to find what the thresholds were for this structure. And on the chart you're looking at, that's the blue line, the blue dotted line, and it says, if your tailwater gets to that line, then your structure fails. And then once you've identified that, pick a curve, it doesn't matter which curve it is, and you go backwards from that time based on the length of time it takes to implement a project. And for many of our major structures, it could take anything from 8 to 10 years to permit and build. And so you back up, in this case, let's assume it's 10 years, and you look at what the condition under the curve you have picked is. And that becomes the threshold that you need to reach to initiate the replacement action or the particular action that you're choosing to take. Now, if you are on an aggressive curve, you would end up having a threshold that is on the high side, and you would, as you advance towards that particular threshold in time, you would begin to take the necessary actions to start the project to replace your structure once that threshold hits. If our projections were wrong and that threshold doesn't arrive for longer, it just means you have a little bit more time. And if you start accelerating towards that threshold faster than you had projected, it means you can move your project forward and start taking the necessary action in an earlier time frame. So this overall concept helped us to do a very key thing for our program. It allowed us to move away from some of the high uncertainties that were associated with the projection of the future sea level and the uncertainty that brought to being able to design, plan, and implement a project. It allowed us to be able to do an assessment that would hold for the 8 or 10 years that it will take to cycle back to each of the basins or each of the watersheds, because your threshold, so long as your structure is the same, the physics that guides its discharges remain the same. Now, the sea level projections could change in that time frame, and that might adjust how quickly you might want to start a project or how late you might be able to wait. But the whole idea is that by separating or by changing the sequence, we're able to do the full analysis, bring a lot of information to the table to the decision makers, and then based on whatever information that we arrive at, we're able to make a determination on when our projects needs to start. Essentially, all I want to share with this last slide is that in looking at our assets in this case, we recognize that not all actions would require you to build something. The action you need to take could be an operational change, and the lead time for that could be small. And on this chart, that's the item that's in the time frame T1. Or you could have something that's regulatory solution mixed with some refurbishment of the existing structure, and the time frame for that could be a little bit shorter, and that could be in the time frame of T2. And you could be in a third frame where you actually have to do a full replacement or something major, assuming that retreat is not the option you've selected, and that will be in the time frame like T3. And so what we've done with the level of service program, at least with the assessment phase, is to adopt this adaptive resilience plan model, use it in what we call an adaptive resilient planning framework to do a level of service assessment. And it's proved very useful for us, and I'm hoping that for others who have projects that lend themselves well to setting thresholds, that you consider this option. It takes a lot of the controversy off the table, and I will be glad to take questions.
Thank you so much, Akin. That's certainly a very innovative model for applying the projections for future planning. I'm going to put 2 quick questions into one, and I apologize that we are behind here. First is whether the water management district's members are elected or appointed. And second, I'm sorry,
I can't hear your question.
You can't hear me? Can you hear me? Akin? Akin, I think it might be on your end. So we're gonna move forward, and if we have time at the end, we'll come back to your questions. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to our next presenter, last but certainly not least. We are delighted to have Dr. Marjolein Hasnoot with us all the way from the Netherlands. Dr. Hasnoot is a senior researcher with Deltares, with a background as an environmental scientist specializing in water management, climate adaptation, integrated assessment modeling, and decision-making under deep uncertainty. She is one of the founders of the Society for Decision-Making Under Deep Uncertainty, as well as a lead author for the IPCC's 6th assessment report. Thank you so much for your presentation today, Dr. Hasnoot, despite the significant time difference.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor after all these very interesting talk to give a presentation on the adaptation pathways. So I will talk about an application for the C7 basin. It was a study that we did a few years ago together with Obi. I think he's also on the call, and my colleagues Catherine Rasco and Ferdinand and Claire Jeuke. Let's see if I can. No, I cannot move the slide. So maybe next slide. So So the idea behind this adaptation pathways, is that there's large uncertainty about future sea level rise. Okay, I think I can control it now. Okay, I'll try later. In this picture, you see how estimates about future sea level rise changed. And the gray ones are the projections from the IPCC, and the blue ones from NOAA. I could add the recent projections there, but what you see is that the uncertainty increased, and that the potential sea level rise for 2100, the bandwidth is much larger. So next slide, please. So the idea behind the adaptation pathways is that it supports decision makers to make decisions and plan for the future despite this uncertainty. So when there's large uncertainty, you get these questions like, what are low regret actions? What should I do now? Which actions can I postpone? What to do first? Or what are robust and flexible actions that we can implement and that will perform well over a wide range of futures? And also maybe some of the issues that came up in the previous presentations about redoing the analysis because new projections came. Next slide, please. So the whole idea is actually that that you anticipate the future with an adaptive plan, and we use this visualization of like a subway map, and that you anticipate the future, identify this kind of roadmap of different measures into the future, and that you then monitor for signals and decide on when to adapt. And this is one of the approaches for decision making under deep uncertainty, and there's a community that is looking into these approaches, and recently we published a book, and it's open access. I think there's a link in the presentation, but if you Google on decision making under deep uncertainty, and you will find a book where there's 5 approaches which are described, and also some applications in practice. Next slide, please. So we have this approach which we call dynamic adaptive policy pathways, which is a stepwise approach. And this slide shows the 7 steps, which is very similar to any other policy analysis framework, but there's a few key features which are different. Maybe you can click on that. Click on the slide, please. So what you see is that in any analysis, you start with the description of the system and the objectives and what are the main uncertainties. But what we then try to do is assess both the vulnerabilities and the opportunities, and identify kind of thresholds, or what we call adaptation or opportunity tipping points, when objectives are not met anymore and when new decisions are needed. It's similar to what Akin just explained in his last few slides. So with these thresholds, and when you know under what condition new actions are needed, you can then decide on explore different sequences of actions, and these are adaptation pathways. And once you have explored this kind of roadmap of possible adaptation pathways, you can map this in kind of this metro map, like showing the solution space. And based on that and an evaluation of the different pathways on the cost and the benefits, you can decide on what could be an adaptive plan. What should I do now? But what also are the options for the future, and what can we monitor, and when, what could be signals that could trigger additional actions or adjustment of the plan. If you go to the next slide. So this approach, I think it's now almost 10 years that we have been applying this. And this is a map of where we identify different applications of pathway studies. And there's a few well-known examples. It's the Dutch Delta program, and the adaptation pathways is core of this program. and that program aims to adapt the Netherlands to future sea level rise and other climate change issues. But also in the UK, there's a well-known example for London, and in New Zealand, it's a very nice example where they started with local applications, but then later, made a whole guidance for coastal adaptation using the adaptation pathways approach, which actually also exists in the state of California, and I think the Army Corps also has a guidance on how to apply adaptation pathways. So we've also applied it for the C7 basin. Maybe you can click on this. So it is in the northeastern part of the Miami-Dade County, and it's actually like a small watershed with a number of smaller basins that drain into the Little River or the C7 canal, and then there's a structure, the S27 structure, that a spillway that drains the water into the sea. If you go to the next slide, please. So we started actually with a workshop, and I think maybe some of the people in the picture in the call, where we discussed on potential issues. If sea level rises, then it's more difficult to drain the water, and what could be potential options to adapt. So together with in different groups, we explored different pathways, different narratives, and based on that, we made a set of portfolios that were further analyzed with a more quantitative analysis. Next slide, please. Maybe you can just click on it so everything comes up. Oh yeah, no, sorry. So the portfolio of measures is doing nothing actually, which is the M0, and the M1 portfolio of measures is more local flood mitigation measures, which consist of like local flood walls or exfiltration trenches, and local pumps. The M2 measures are more like regional flood mitigation measures, which are the forward pumps like the S27 spillway, or additional larger pumps. And then there's a whole set of more like land use mitigation options, which is very similar to the measures that were discussed before, like raising roads or raising buildings. And then we explored different levels of elevation. Next slide, please. So we did this quantitative analysis with a hydrological model, which was done by a consultant, ADA, which was then input for a damage model, the Delft-Fiat model, where we used water depth, and then assessed the damages to roads and to buildings, and translated that into an expected annual damage map. And then we did that for all the portfolios of measures. Can you click on this and go to the next slide maybe? Because that information was used then to assess these adaptation tipping points. So under what conditions would we reach this threshold? Yes, thank you. We started with the assumption, what if the expected annual damage should not become worse? So we took the current expected annual damage as a threshold. And then what you see in this picture, you see the sea level rise and the calculated expected annual damage for the different portfolios of measures. So the black line is not doing anything. So if sea level rises, what you see is that the black line increases a lot. And then the green line is with the local mitigation measures, where you see that helps to extend the the threshold. So well, without any measures, we already have this current threshold without sea level rise, but with the M1 measures, the local mitigation measures, we don't reach this threshold until 0.55 feet of sea level rise. But you also see with the land use measures, the orange line, that this is extended even further. So then we can compare that with sea level rise scenarios, and these are slightly different, I think, from the ones from the recent report. But what I actually could have done is put also the numbers of this new report underneath here. So without any further additional analysis, we can just say like the threshold of 0.55 feet of sea level rise still counts, and then the timing when this occurs is different under different sea level rise scenarios. Next slide, please. So this kind of information, here, this is the example of the timing. So this information we use for the adaptation pathways. So again, you see here the sea level rise, and then the different measures. So in red are the structural measures, the flood mitigation measures, and in green the land use measures. And you see how much sea level rise they can address without exceedance of this current expected annual damage. And then what you actually do is you start to sketch different adaptation pathways. So if you can click further, you can start with a small regional pump, the pink line, and combine that with large regional pumps, maybe the local mitigation measures. But if you would combine all these structural measures, that could take you, at a maximum up to 1 feet of sea level rise for this basin, considering this expected annual damage as a threshold. But if you, at some point you would need to implement these land use measures. But of course, it takes a lot of time to implement these land use measures. So an adaptive plan could be to install some pumps and at the same time start changing your land use. Next slide, please. Obi, who asked me to give this presentation, also asked me to give some information on how in the Netherlands we are considering much higher amounts of sea level rise, which were also addressed in the report, had the NOAA high and the NOAA extreme. So recently in the Netherlands we did a quite extensive study. What would it mean if we would need to adapt to very high and accelerated sea level rise? And in this picture, you see the sea level rise that might occur for the Dutch coast. The dark area is the amount of sea level rise that we are currently considering in the adaptive plan. But if sea level rises faster, which is very uncertain, but if it rises faster, if we have a large accelerated mass loss from Antarctica, then we might get much higher amount of sea level, up to 2 meters in 2100. So what we showed is like if it occurs much faster, like for example with this black dashed line, maybe you can click on things now. And if we would implement a measure that could address about 50 centimeters of sea level rise, then the lifetime of that measure would be about 65 years. And 50 centimeters of sea level rise, I heard someone saying about the Dutch in the example of Amsterdam, but the Dutch are well known also for their delta works, which are very large structures, and they were built for 40 centimeters of sea level rise. And the idea was that they would have a lifetime of 200 years. So if sea level rises much faster, such investment, the lifetime would be much shorter. And if we would do another 50 centimeters, so we get up to 1 meter, then the lifetime of such an investment would only be 20 years. and even another 50 centimeters, the lifetime would only be 10 years. So these investment of these infrastructures, well, you want these investments to last much longer, like 50 or 100 or 200 years, like as we intended to do. With this faster and higher amounts of sea level rise, the lifetime becomes much shorter. So the question then becomes, can we adapt that fast? Because can you click on it further? Or we need to adapt to much higher levels of sea level rise, not with 50 centimeters, but with 1 meter. But if you then consider the lead time that you need for implementing and for planning, which was also shown in the picture from Akin, like a planning horizon of 30 years is not weird if you have to build such large structures or any other adaptation measures. It can take a lot of time. And then if you count backwards, for example, in this with the amount of investment up to 50 centimeters of sea level rise, we are already quite near the moment at which we need to take decisions. So that's why the Dutch have launched another program to look at this, and maybe from this adaptive planning, we need to revise and adapt much earlier than we first considered. Next slide, please. So in a follow-up study, we also considered additional pathways, and then we looked much broader than the traditional protect, keep the water out approach that we are following in the Netherlands. We wanted to explore the whole solution space. Also look at advance, which going seawards with islands and new barriers, but also with accommodate, which where we have much less protection levels and allow more water on the streets. And we use that also to identify again what would be needed on the short term, and what kind of information would be needed, what kind of research would we need to kind of keep this solution space open. And also, if we are going to build houses, where do we want to do that? So to summarize my final slide, can you click further? Yeah. So the idea of the adaptation pathways is to explore the solution space and map this and also discuss with stakeholders what are potential options. And we've seen in practice that it helps to open the different options that are considered. It also identifies path dependencies of decisions. Decisions that you take now also influence the decisions that you, the options that you have for the future, and also kind of unravel the whole plan into different smaller steps. And this also helps to overcome this paralysis that sometimes exist if there is a large uncertainty. The approach of the adaptation tipping points, which helps to assess under what conditions decisions, these thresholds are reached and when decisions need to be taken. So that's similar to what Akina explained. And with monitoring, you can detect signals on if adjustments or additional actions are needed. So I also briefly addressed this. There's different assessment modes. Sometimes people think that you need huge, complex, comprehensive models, but there's a way to kind of, in the different stages, assess the different pathways. And I think Akin already mentioned, but also in the Netherlands, we are considering investments to recover after the COVID-19. What we say is like we need to mitigate climate change, of course, but also avoid that these investments, which are taken now under high time pressure, that avoid that we become more vulnerable. So we should use it as an opportunity to anticipate, for example, sea level rise or socioeconomic development. So we make wise investments that we don't regret later. So with that, I take questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hasnoot. Keen talks about the lead time for constructing projects, and of course there's also time considerations regarding making political decisions and putting together financing, as well as the important work of engaging communities where adaptation measures are taking place. So does the model of adaptive pathways take into account these other aspects in these timelines?
Yeah, so what I showed in this last picture was these different time scales of adaptation. So there's the tipping point gives you an idea of the lifetime of your investment, and if you have an idea on when this tipping point may occur, you can consider the lead time of a follow-up measure, and then you know more or less when to take actions. So what we've seen with this, if we get a high-end sea level rise, then that will be a huge challenge, because the time could be our enemy actually, because we are very well with all kinds of technical issues, and yeah, we can do a lot, but at some point we need to do it very fast, and that will be a challenge.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Hasnoot. Really appreciate it. And I also want to thank the audience for sticking with us 15 minutes over. I apologize that we ran over and bearing with our some of our technical difficulties. Just want to thank all of our speakers again today for sharing their expertise and your interest and participation, as well as the work that you're doing to build resilience to climate change within your communities. As a quick reminder, the next webinar in this series will take place next Wednesday, July 1st from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. Eastern, where we will turn to a critical discussion among a lineup of fantastic speakers who will discuss a range of topics from equitable and holistic adaptation investments, co-creating adaptation responses with frontline communities, decision-making in the face of uncertainty, and alignment between state and regional efforts. By registering for today's webinar, you automatically are registered for next week's webinar. A recording of today's webinar will be posted, on the Compact's website in the coming days. We very much look forward to your participation next week, and thank you again. Have a wonderful day.